Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you find yourself, I hope you're having a fabulous day. And welcome back for this week in cultural anthropology, focusing on magic, religion, and ritual. This is a really fun topic. And in fact, there are lots, this is kind of like a cornerstone course, even when you go to a four-year institution. Most universities or four-year institutions have an entire semester-long course about magic, religion, and ritual, often called magic, religion, and witchcraft in some cases. But it's a great course. It's a course that a lot of people look back to and think about as an adult and really have connected with anthropology through this course. So if your plans are continuing on to a four-year institution, and you're interested in cultural anthropology, you've had a good time in this course, I would strongly encourage you to continue on that path and continue to explore the different components of anthropology. All right. Thank you also for working with me and being patient to get this lecture recorded. I know we had some technical difficulties this week, and so I appreciate your patience. Thank you. All right, so what is this stuff called about religion and magic, and what makes it different? So religion is, hopefully you've had the opportunity to look at some of the other videos that I've posted for this week. And coming up with a definition for religion is really, really difficult. Trying to compartmentalize religion, because, and it's a bit, unfair, because religion is really vast and it has a very specific roles in society and really important roles in society as well. Religion is really used to frame our everyday experience. And so I guess the best definition that we can really come up with that's general enough to be inclusive, but specific enough to not be totally, rudderless and completely vague. So religion is a set of attitudes, beliefs, and practices pertaining to a supernatural power or powers, whether that rests in forces, gods, spirits, ghosts, or demons. And as you no doubt guessed, variation, there's such great variation in religious beliefs, including the types of supernatural forces and beings that people in religious areas discuss and talk about and believe in. I'm just going to go over a couple of those. There are lots of them. One that you may or may not be familiar with is mana. And mana is a supernatural, impersonal force that inhabits certain objects or people, and it's believed to confer a sense of success or strength. So, for example, mana it is very commonly discussed in the various cultural practices and religious philosophies of many indigenous communities, very specific to the Pacific Islanders. So mana is discussed there, and mana exists in for example, in Hawaii and the Polynesian cultures, the feather capes. In other indigenous mainland areas, mana is in our hair. It's part of the reason why our hair is very important and we grow our hair very, very long and don't cut it. And that's very similar to even other religions throughout the world. For example, the Sikh religion, cutting of the hair, there are taboos around that and reasons for why you don't cut your hair, right? And the reason why hair is often associated with a form or a type of mana, whether you use the word mana or not, but it has great spiritual value. So it comes from our head, right? It grows out of our head. And what's inside of our head? This really amazing organ, our brain, right? And it's incredibly powerful. Our brains are so powerful, right? We can manifest things with our brains. We can solve problems with our brains. We can do all kinds of things. There is this great force inside of our skulls and our brains and in this organ, and so hair grows out of that, right? And so it's endued with those thoughts and that power, right? And so cutting it off would be like cutting off a limb in some cases, right? The other thing we've already talked about, this idea of taboos, right? Taboos are very common in religious practices, or often discussed as in a religious philosophy sort of way. Taboo is a force, it's a power, right? If you violate this prohibition, the forces that will exert themselves on you to correct your behavior are great, right? So that's a type of supernatural force, the universe in a way, holding you to a supernatural punishment of sorts, right? Often in courses, specifically around religion, we always have to approach this question of what is the usefulness of religion? What is the usefulness of taboos or mana or supernatural powers in general? What is it about religion that demonstrates it's very useful? Well, this is just one example to give you an example of where you can look, or the types of justifications for the usefulness of religion, is among the New England fishermen here in the United States and in Canada. And there are lots of taboos surrounding the behavior of those fishermen. It's very superstitious, right? And it may not necessarily lend itself to a religious belief or practice, but it's certainly something that these rituals that go along with these superstitious beliefs, those practices can affect our success, reduce risk, and we may consider them useful or adaptive if they reduce our anxieties. And reducing anxiety, really, when you talk to therapists or psychologists or even neurologists, right? Reducing anxiety indirectly maximizes our success, right? And this is part of where I get I inform my teaching philosophy. I do my best to reduce the anxieties that students, any student, right, any learner would have about learning new material, right? It's unfamiliar. It is maybe complicated. You've got these complicated terms or complicated ideas. And if I can reduce anxiety, especially like test taking and paper writing and things like that, right? Whatever I can do to reduce stress maximizes the outcomes for students. If you are anxious while you're learning, right, it doesn't lend itself to really absorbing the information. Your mind is too busy and distracted by all of those things that are anxiety provoking. Oh, is this going to be on the test? Is that going to be on the test? How much do I need to know about this, right? So limiting that maximizes success. And so that's really important. That's a really important and useful function of philosophies and religion, is if they can help us reduce our anxiety about life experiences or the world around us, the more it helps us maximize our individual and communal success. There's also variation in the types of supernatural beings that are out there. So there are supernatural forces, there are rituals associated with those forces and taboos with those forces, but there's also supernatural beings, right? There's a lot of variation in different types of supernatural beings. And really, they come from two primary groups. They come from a non-human group and a human origin, right? So we divide supernatural beings by those two classifications. And so what do we mean by non-human origins? We're talking about gods and spirits, things in beings that have never been human. They might be human-like, right? They might have some anthropomorphic type features. You know, if you look at the Greek and Roman gods, they could look like human beings, right? But they could also look like other types of beings as well, you know, bulls or arrows, or they could take the form of all kinds of different animate objects or even inanimate objects, right? Spirits. What's the difference between gods and spirits? Gods are usually named. They have they're supernatural beings of non-human origin. They're named personalities, and again, they're anthropomorphic, right? Spirits, on the other hand, are unnamed supernatural beings, and they tend to be in the hierarchy of supernatural beings. We think of them as less prestigious than gods, right? Gods seem very official because they're named, right? They have named personalities and characters, whereas spirits tend to be unnamed, right? And depending on what philosophy or religion you're talking about, spirits are incredibly powerful, but again, they tend to not they don't carry the same sort of prestigious sort of anthropomorphic behaviors, right, or attributes that we assign to gods. Spirits are often closer to humans, right, in terms of proximity. Gods are very far removed. They have a special place. In Greek culture, they lived on Mount Olympus. They were assigned and separate. They had a special place to live and exist. Spirits are just generally all over. They're around us constantly, right? They're part of our immediate environments. So their proximity to humans is closer. They're often helpful or considered helpful, but they're also it can be very mischievous or even evil, right? So they can be very benevolent and helpful. They can be malevolent, and they can be very mischievous as well. So think of sprites, right? So in Ireland and in Scotland, we talk about having fairies and sprites, and they're very mischievous beings, and they can, depending on how they feel or how they feel they've been treated, will either be very helpful or very harmful, right? Human origin. There are supernatural beings that are of human origin. These include ghosts, right? So these are supernatural beings that were once human, the embodiment of the souls of people that have passed on, right? And then there's also the more named beings, which are ancestral spirits. And these are supernatural beings who are the ghosts of our past relatives, right? So what about the character of supernatural beings? So why do gods and spirits in particular cultures exhibit certain character traits rather than others? This is a great question, and it's really the foundation of anthropologic exploration into cultures, philosophies, and religions. This is really what we're coming to. What is it about your spiritual and God, beings and gods? Why do they have certain characteristics? How does that help in this particular cultural context? Did the culture, the culture gives these individuals or these beings their character. And so, is it a warning? Is there a special message in here? Are these cautionary tales? Are they, prohibitances? Or are they, things that we should be doing? Or are they models for our behavior, right? Or models for what we shouldn't be doing? Right. So, why is there this great variation? And this is really a lot of fun to explore in asking questions and thinking about things. And the character of supernatural beings manifests in just really fascinating sorts of ways. There's also, in some cultures, a hierarchy or structure to the supernatural beings. um, and it's in some cases, not in all cases, right? And so some of the questions from anthropologists are, why why is it that you have a higher God and others, and other religions and philosophies simply don't have a hierarchy to gods. And in fact, some religions don't have gods at all. So for example, Buddhism is, is not about having this a particular set of God, like very powerful gods, right? In Buddhism, there's a teacher, right? Buddha, Siddhartha, is a teacher, is somebody to, ask us questions or force us to look inside, right? And Siddhartha is an incredibly flawed human being, right? And you read, the stories of Siddhartha and Buddha, right? And you find that he's an incredibly flawed human being and has come to be enlightened. And so there's, all of these teachings are about that pathway to be enlightened and more gentle and compassionate and open to the world, right? And open to experiences and not to hold judgment and things of that nature, right? So there are religions that don't have gods associated with them, right? And then there are others that have a plethora of gods, right? You look at Greek and Roman gods, and there's, gods for everything, right? And there's a very distinct hierarchy to them as well, right? So this really gets into this question of, singular God or multiple gods. And we have specialized words, of course, for those, as always. So in a monotheistic religious practice, we're talking about one God. There's one high God that is in charge of everything, and it carries the most important role, right? And there might be other supernatural beings, but they are lesser beings. They are not gods, right? There's just one God. Okay. And then there's a different avenue. It's called polytheistic. And this is the recognition of many gods, none of whom is believed to be subordinate, right? And so this really brings to question, some really, hopefully one of the things that you're asking yourself is, well, what about those Greek and Roman gods, right? The pantheons of gods. Well, there's a hierarchy there. So is that a monotheistic or is that a polytheistic religion? All right. Um, and you could argue either way, right? Because there is, Zeus is the most powerful god. He is the one that is in charge, right? And there are all kinds of other supernatural beings and other lesser gods, right? And those lesser gods, they challenge each other back and forth for power, right? There are lots of stories about that if you've taken a Greek mythology class, right? So is that monotheism or is that polytheistic? And again, to be polytheistic, generally speaking, none of the other many gods are subordinate. They're all considered equal. So that's one of the key things there. And so, what is the purpose of gods? And really what that comes down to is the purpose of gods and recognizing gods is for intervention in human affairs, right? Think about if you are a religious person, what is it that you receive from your god or gods or spirits, right? what are you asking for? Why do you communicate with them? Why do you acknowledge them? These types of things, right? And it's really about intervention, right? And it's intervention in our community, in our nation, in our world, maybe as, certainly as individuals, we ask for intervention in our human affairs, right? But there are multiple different kinds of intervention too. There's the kind of intervention that we simply don't ask for, right? That just simply happens. These are the times when we sit there and go, well, the universe had a lesson for me, or the gods had a lesson for me, or God had a lesson for me, right? It was the unasked for divine intervention or interference in our lives. Some really great examples of that are Poseidon and Odysseus. We can see that, Odysseus really was not looking for the assistance or the intervention of Poseidon, but Poseidon was definitely there to make his voyage quite a bit more difficult than need be. All right, the Yahweh and the Great Flood are another examples. And when do unasked for divine interference happen? Often it's because there are violations of taboos. That certainly applies to Poseidon and Odysseus. Poseidon was just quite beside himself for Odysseus's, brazen sort of and crass behavior, right? So we violated taboos. Sometimes we unconsciously are requesting intervention, or our lives are going in a direction that we know inherently that it's not the right direction. And so, gods and spirits can interpret that intervention request, right? And oftentimes, there can be, other types of examples of unasked for divine interference, as well as direct interference in some cases, is change in weather, right? Sometimes we're just asking for a change. It's simple modifications of our immediate environments in order to procure the resources that we need, right? And of course, there are various ways to get in touch with the supernatural, right? Lots of different practices, lots of different ways to request intervention or to express gratitude, right? Prayer, a physiological experience. So oftentimes we talk about mind-altering substances used in ritual, right? And that's a physiological experience. Meditation, right? It's another way to do it. That's a physiological experience. Simulation, right? So things like confessions, that's a type of simulated conversation. Other types of simulated conversations with the supernatural include, practicing being a medium, where a medium can communicate between the living across different spaces. Other ways to get in touch, things like feasts. Feasts are amazing rituals and amazing ways to bring community together to get in touch essentially with the supernatural, right? And while it tends to feel like more of a celebration, there's a lot of powerful energy at feasts, right? And you're coming together at a feast, often in a common goal or around a common activity in celebration of something or honoring something, like a great harvest, for example. Or a naming of a child or a baptism, right? You have these sharing of food in a community has a lot of powerful energy to it, and that is a way to open that space between the supernatural and humans. The other way to do it, another common practice, is through sacrifices, right? So this can be animal sacrifices. Lent is a type of sacrifice, right? It's personal sacrifice to express your commitment to a particular to the supernatural, to God, right? So these are all different types of sacrifices. Other types of religious practices that are out there, magic. And magic is very interesting. There are two modes of interacting with the supernatural. Those two modes are asking and compelling, right? So we can ask for things and then we can compel spirits to do things through the use of magic. Right. And so how do we define magic? And it's really the performance of certain rituals that are believed to compel the supernatural powers to act in particular ways. There's also, in magic is aside and separate. In some cases, there's a little bit of overlap between magic and what we call sorcery and witchcraft. Right, sorcery is the use of certain materials to invoke supernatural powers to harm people, right? So this is about malevolent, harming individuals. Witchcraft is the practice of attempting to harm people by supernatural means, but through emotions and thought alone, not through the use of tangible objects, right? And witchcraft, well, and sorcery, and generally have been categorized as ways to harm individuals. There are variations of this, and that are about benevolent practices, and it's not about harming each other. So, for example, Wicca, Wiccan, right? These are not harmful practices, and they're not set out to harm people, right? There are very strong taboos about sending negative things out into the universe, right? Because that the taboo is such that if you send negativity or harm somebody through your practices, that can come back to you sevenfold. And it might not come back to you as the individual, right? It might come back to you in later generations. Like it might harm your family later in your generational line, like your people that come after you. Or it could harm your friends, your immediate family, your now family. Right, so there are very strong taboos and cautions against these types of practices, because it's about harvesting power and taking power from the universe to exert harm on others. So there are lots of cautions there. Right. There are also what we call religious specialists. So these are the practitioners or the specialists that help guide us in our pathways in a particular religious practice. So there are shaman and shamanika, priests and priestesses. There's divination, so a diviner, prophet, and really there are lots and lots of different types of religious specialists as well. Types of practitioners. So sorcerers and witches are practitioners, right? Mediums are a type of practitioner, and priests and priestesses. So we're not talking about like the clergy that you might find in the Catholic religion or things like that, but priests that oversee different types of practitioners of magic, for example. So let's talk about the shaman a little bit. What is a shaman? This is a religious intermediary, right? Usually not an official role or a full-time sort of economic pursuit, right? It's not something that they usually do 100% of the time as their profession, right? So it's considered part-time. The primary function of a shaman is to cure people through sacred songs or pantomime or other means, right? And oftentimes these individuals are mistakenly called witch doctors by Westerners, right? The shaman is really a herbalist in some cases. So, somebody that can put together medicines, sing songs, say prayers, say words that will help cure people in their ailments, whether it's a spiritual ailment or a physical ailment, right? So they're religious specialists with a direct association with supernaturals. Shamans are most associated with non-state type societies, right? The there's a lot. This idea of shamanism, really, the classic area of study is throughout Siberia in northern Russia, and while it's part-time, um, as with most religious specialists, and actually in most professions, you're called to your profession, right? And that's, when we love our professions and we do really great work, is when we listen to those callings to our professions, right? These are our innermost desires. This is what we want to do, right? So there's a calling to that profession. Now, priests and priestesses are a little bit different, right? They're most often associated with states. They are full-time religious specialists. Generally speaking, they are going through a formal training process. There's a priestly lineage oftentimes, so that this role is handed down through generations, right? So it's not necessarily, you may be called to it, but it might be part of just what you do in the family, right? That's what the family profession is. They perform a wider range of rituals than do shamans. And they may have substantial secular power as well. So it's not just spiritual power, right, or supernatural power, or being able to communicate or do things with a supernatural power, but oftentimes they have a lot of worldly power or community power, secular power outside of the religious practices. So what is the difference between religion and magic? So 19th century thinkers supported a sort of cultural evolution model that said magic came first and was replaced by religion, and religion was replaced by science. I think that this is a very narrow focus or way of describing any sort of hierarchy. I don't think that there is necessarily a hierarchy, and so a more common practice, contemporary thinkers um, believe that magic and religion are kind of in the same sort of vein of things, right? And science is really assigned separate. So these are really, when we're talking about magic, religion, and science, we're really talking about different ways of knowing things, right? And each of them have their own domain of knowledge, and they're different domains, and they overlap a little bit, right? Um, but to think of these as exclusive categories or a structured or a hierarchy, I think is creating false dichotomies, right? So magic, generally people are talking about magic as attempts to compel supernatural forces and beings to act in certain ways, and magic is often thought about as being harmful, but that's not exactly accurate either. That would be a very myopic sort of perspective about magic. Magic is not just about harming, right? So religion and adaptation. So often as anthropologists, we're asking what purpose in the larger what goal does religion serve, and how has it assisted humans in their adaptation and survival? And so many anthropologists will take the view that religions are adaptive. It's simply because they do reduce anxieties, and that's really a core. And that's to say reduce anxieties is no small feat either. As human beings, we have lots of anxieties about all kinds of things, and in particular survival. And that's really a important. It's a big deal, right? Our natural survival. And if we can reduce our anxieties about that, again, we can, reducing anxieties help us, in terms of clearer thinking. We can listen better, we can understand better, right? And which means that ultimately we can create more success, either in our individual lives or our communities. And so reducing the anxieties and certainties, these are things that affect all people, and it's a huge thing. And so to say that religion's purpose, it helps us adapt, because it helps us reduce anxieties, is no small thing. And so I don't want that to seem like I'm trivializing religion or magic. It's not. This is no trivial matter at all. It's really it's really essential and an important, critically important function in the human experience. So what of cultural anthropology and religion? The study of religion was really a very early focus of cultural anthropologists. Why? Because at the time when anthropology was budding as a profession, religious differences are what were probably really very quite obvious differences between different cultures, right? And, it was really about understanding those differences. And of course, in the 19th century, the focus was on primitive and non-Western religions. So Western religions have been well known, have been documented and discussed in the quote unquote old world for a very long time. But as colonialism and expansion, imperialism, and things like that were happening globally, there was a notice that there are these other types of practices that are very, very unfamiliar and unusual, in the eyes of the colonists and colonialists and imperialists and explorers and adventurers, right? It seemed very unusual and unfamiliar to them. So it was really, their focus of trying to understand it was, again, the very egotistical sort of hubris stance of most colonists and imperialists, right? Conquerors. They categorized everything that was different from what they were doing as less than or more primitive in comparison. And we know that that's just simply, again, creating false hierarchies. Current research tends to look at religion in all societies, including modern states. Religion is a very interesting thing, and it's very interesting right now to see where religion is taking us and how it's being used. How is religion used by human beings to support or argue for different perspectives, for example? So that's the end of this first part. We will come back and start talking about religion in a comparative perspective, and that will be recording number 2. We'll see you then.